What happens when an astronaut accidentally opens a portal to a hostile alien world? You won't believe how one mistake could put all of humanity on the brink of extinction. The silence of space was supposed to be calming, but for David Chan, it felt suffocating. He floated outside the research station orbiting Earth's moon, his visor reflecting the cold light of distant stars. His mission had been routine, repairing a malfunctioning communications array, but somewhere deep inside him, he knew something wasn't right. A faint hum vibrated through his suit, growing louder by the second. It wasn't coming from his equipment. It was something else entirely, something ancient and alive. As David turned toward the source of the sound, his breath hitched. Beneath him, embedded in the station's hull, was an object that shouldn't exist. A pulsating artifact carved with symbols no human could decipher. It looked like obsidian but shimmered with veins of molten gold. Against every protocol drilled into his head during training, curiosity got the better of him. He reached out, his gloved hand brushing against its surface. That's when everything changed. A blinding flash erupted, followed by a deafening roar that seemed to tear apart reality itself. When David regained consciousness, floating before him was a swirling vortex of fire and shadows. It wasn't just a portal, it was a gateway to another world. And as he stared into its depths, he realized this wasn't going to end well. David tried to pull himself away, but the gravitational pull of the portal was stronger than anything he'd ever encountered. His thrusters sputtered uselessly as he fought against the inexorable force dragging him closer. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing through his helmet like a war drum. Panic gripped him as he realized there was no escape. The artifact, dormant for who knows how long, had awakened, and now it was taking him somewhere far beyond the reaches of human understanding. Finally, with a violent surge, the portal consumed him whole. Darkness enveloped him, and for a moment, he thought he'd been obliterated. But then came the sensation of falling, of being pulled through a tunnel of shifting colors and sounds that defied comprehension. He heard whispers, voices speaking in languages that made no sense yet carried an undeniable weight of malice. When the descent ended, David found himself sprawled on unfamiliar ground. The air smelled acrid, and the sky above churned with crimson clouds streaked with veins of black lightning. Jagged rocks jutted upward like broken teeth, and rivers of molten lava snaked across the landscape. This place radiated hostility, as if the very land itself sought to expel him. He scrambled to his feet, trying to assess his surroundings, but movement caught his eye. Shadows darted between the boulders, too fast for him to make out their shapes clearly. Whatever they were, they weren't friendly. As one emerged into view, David froze. Its body twisted unnaturally, covered in scales that gleamed like shards of glass. Eyes burned with malevolent intelligence, locking onto him as if sizing him up for slaughter. We've only scratched the surface here, but trust me, things are about to escalate beyond anything you can imagine. Stay tuned because what happens next will leave you questioning whether humanity has any hope at all. David tried to retreat, but the pull of the portal was too strong. His thrusters sputtered uselessly as the vortex swallowed him whole. For a moment, there was nothing but chaos. Burning winds tore at his suit, and voices whispered in languages he couldn't understand. Then suddenly he landed hard on solid ground. But this wasn't Earth anymore. Cryos stretched endlessly around him, a nightmare landscape of jagged black rocks and rivers of molten lava. The sky churned with crimson clouds, and the air crackled with electricity. In the distance, towering spires made of bone-like material pierced the horizon. This place wasn't natural, it was hostile. Every instinct screamed at him to run. But where? The portal behind him remained ominously active, its glow casting eerie shadows across the terrain. Before long, movement caught his eye. At first, they were silhouettes, shadows darting between the rocks, but soon their forms became clearer. They weren't animals or machines. These creatures were something else entirely. their bodies twisted unnaturally, covered in scales that glinted like shards of glass. Eyes burned with malevolent intelligence, locking onto David as if sizing him up for slaughter. He scrambled to activate his communicator, desperate to warn someone back home. But static greeted him instead of a voice. Alone, unarmed, and surrounded, David knew survival wouldn't come easy. Yet even then, he couldn't shake the feeling that opening the portal was only the beginning of a much larger catastrophe. This is where the story starts spiraling out of control. We're teetering on the edge of disaster, and you won't believe what happens next. Stick around, because missing this would mean missing one of the most thrilling moments yet. Desperation fueled David's actions as he sprinted toward higher ground. Each step sent tremors through the unstable soil beneath his boots, forcing him to leap over fissures spewing toxic fumes. Behind him, the creatures grew bolder, their guttural growls echoing off the cliffs. One lunged forward, its claws scraping against his helmet, leaving a jagged scratch across the visor. Panic surged through him, but adrenaline kept him moving. Reaching the top of a ridge, David spotted something unusual, an enormous obelisk jutting out of the ground. Its surface pulsed faintly, mirroring the same golden veins as the artifact that opened the portal. If he could get close enough, maybe he could figure out how to reverse the process. But getting there meant crossing open terrain, fully exposed to whatever horrors lurked below. Time slowed as he made his decision. With a deep breath, David bolted downhill, zigzagging to avoid direct confrontation. The creatures pursued relentlessly, their movements unnervingly fast despite their grotesque forms. Just as one nearly pounced, a sudden explosion rocked the area. Fire erupted from the base of the obelisk, sending debris flying in all directions. David shielded himself, heart pounding as he realized the structure might not be salvation after all. It could very well be the source of this hellish realm. The obelisk loomed ahead, its surface etched with intricate carvings that seemed to shift under his gaze. The symbols pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. David hesitated, unsure whether approaching it was wise. But with the creatures closing in, he didn't have much choice. As he drew nearer, the temperature around him spiked drastically, making sweat bead on his forehead inside the suit. Suddenly, a low rumble emanated from the obelisk, and the ground quaked violently. Cracks spiderwebbed outward, revealing glowing energy beneath. The creatures screeched in unison, retreating momentarily as if wary of the power emanating from the structure. David seized the opportunity, sprinting toward it with renewed determination. But just as he reached out to touch the obelisk, a voice boomed in his mind, not through his comms, but directly inside his skull. "Who dares disturb our slumber?" it demanded, dripping with malice. David recoiled, clutching his helmet as pain shot through his temples. The voice in David's mind was overwhelming, a cacophony of anger and authority that reverberated through every nerve in his body. "Who dares disturb our slumber?" it repeated, each word laced with venom. David staggered backward, clutching his helmet as if trying to shield himself from the psychic onslaught. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he might pass out. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the voice ceased. When he opened his eyes again, the obelisk loomed taller than before, its golden veins pulsating with an almost hypnotic rhythm. The air around it shimmered, distorting reality itself. David realized this wasn't just a structure. It was alive, sentient, and deeply connected to the creatures that now circled him cautiously. Their glowing eyes were fixed on the obelisk, as if awaiting further instructions. Summoning what little courage he had left, David shouted back, though his voice trembled, "I didn't mean to come here. I'm just trying to survive." The response was immediate and chilling. From the base of the obelisk, tendrils of shadow coiled upward, twisting into the shape of a humanoid figure. Its form solidified, revealing a towering entity clad in armor forged from darkness. Horns curled backward from its skull-like helm, and its cape flowed like liquid shadow. Two glowing slits where eyes should have been locked onto David, radiating pure malice. "You are not welcome here," the entity declared, its voice resonating like thunder. "Your intrusion has awakened forces beyond your comprehension." David's heart sank. He'd hoped for answers, maybe even a way back home, but instead, he'd triggered something far worse. The ground quaked violently as more creatures emerged from the shadows, larger and more menacing than those he'd encountered earlier. They surrounded him, cutting off any chance of escape. David's mind raced as he assessed his options. Retreat was impossible, and fighting these beasts barehanded would be suicide. But surrendering wasn't an option either. Summoning every ounce of courage, he shouted back at the entity, "If I don't belong here, then why did you bring me?" The response came swiftly, accompanied by a wave of psychic force that knocked David off his feet. "Foolish mortal," the entity sneered. "Your kind unleashed this upon yourselves. Now you shall bear witness to our wrath." At that moment, the obelisk pulsed brighter, bathing the entire area in an unholy light. The creatures roared in unison, their twisted forms writhing as if feeding off the energy. David noticed something peculiar. Their aggression seemed to ebb and flow in sync with the obelisk's rhythm. Could it be controlling them? If so, disabling it might buy him time or doom him entirely. Gritting his teeth, David grabbed a chunk of fractured debris and hurled it at the obelisk. Sparks flew as the impact disrupted its surface momentarily. The reaction was immediate. The creatures screeched in fury, converging on him with terrifying speed. Dodging left and right, David narrowly avoided being torn apart. The creature's claws slashed through the air mere inches from his suit, shredding fabric and exposing wiring. He tripped over loose rubble, landing hard on his side. Pain shot through his ribs, but adrenaline dulled the sensation. Rolling onto his back, he kicked one assailant away, buying precious seconds to scramble to his feet. Above him, the obelisk's glow intensified, casting grotesque shadows across the battlefield. David noticed faint lines running along its base. Seams, perhaps? If he could pry it open or destabilize it somehow, maybe he could shut down the portal. But doing so required getting past the horde surrounding him. Just as hope seemed lost, inspiration struck. Remembering a utility tool clipped to his belt, David activated its plasma cutter function. The blade ignited with a soft hum, slicing cleanly through anything it touched. Brandishing it like a weapon, he charged forward, surprising his attackers. The first creature fell with a sickening crunch, its head severed cleanly from its body. Encouraged, David fought with renewed vigor, carving a path toward the obelisk. Each swing of the plasma cutter brought David closer to his goal, but the cost was mounting. Fatigue weighed heavily on his limbs, and sweat pooled inside his helmet, fogging his visor. Still, he pushed on, driven by the knowledge that failure meant certain death, for him and potentially billions back on Earth. Finally reaching the obelisk, he examined its base more closely. The seams were deeper than he'd thought, forming a precise grid pattern. Using the cutter, he began slicing along the lines, sparks flying as metal met energy. The obelisk shuddered in response, emitting a low, resonant hum that set his teeth on edge. Behind him, the remaining creatures regrouped, circling warily. Sensing weakness, they attacked en masse. David spun around, swinging wildly with the cutter. Limbs and torsos separated under the blade's power, but the sheer number overwhelmed him. Cornered, he braced for the inevitable. Then, without warning, the obelisk exploded outward, releasing a torrent of raw energy. Blinded by the brilliance, David shielded his face as shockwaves rippled across the land. When the light faded, silence reigned. Breathing heavily, David lowered his arm and surveyed the aftermath. The obelisk lay shattered, its fragments smoldering in the dirt. Around him, the creatures twitched feebly before collapsing altogether. Whatever connection they'd shared with the structure had been severed. For a brief moment, relief washed over him. He'd done it, he'd neutralized the threat. But as he turned back toward the portal, dread settled in once again. Instead of shrinking or dissipating, the vortex appeared stronger than ever, its edges churning violently. Worse still, new shapes began emerging from within, larger, more imposing figures clad in armor forged from darkness itself. These weren't mindless beasts. They carried weapons and moved with calculated precision. Leading them was a towering figure whose presence exuded authority. Horns curled backward from its skull-like helm, and its cape flowed like liquid shadow. It locked eyes with David, who instinctively took a step back. "Your interference ends now," the figure declared, raising a massive sword that crackled with energy. David didn't wait for an invitation to fight. Turning on his heels, he sprinted toward the portal, hoping to reach safety before the armored horde closed the gap. But they were faster than anticipated, spreading out to flank him. Trapped between enemies and certain doom, David improvised. Grabbing a fallen creature's spear, he hurled it at the nearest pursuer, impaling it through the chest. The distraction bought him seconds, just enough to dive behind a rocky outcrop. Peering around the corner, he watched as the leader gestured angrily, signaling his troops to advance. David knew hiding wouldn't work forever. He needed a plan, and fast. Scanning the area, his gaze landed on a cluster of volatile crystals protruding from the ground nearby. An idea formed. If he could trigger an explosion near the portal, maybe it would destabilize the connection and seal it permanently. The risk was astronomical, but staying put guaranteed failure. Taking a deep breath, David prepared to make his move. With a burst of speed, he dashed toward the crystals, drawing fire from the enemy ranks. Energy blasts singed the air around him, narrowly missing his suit. Reaching the cluster, he activated the plasma cutter once more, focusing its beam on the largest crystal. Cracks spiderwebbed across its surface, glowing ominously as pressure built within. The leader bellowed commands, urging his forces to intercept. Too late, the crystal detonated in a spectacular display of light and heat, engulfing the battlefield. David shielded himself as best he could, praying the blast would achieve its intended effect. When the dust settled, the portal flickered erratically before collapsing inward with a deafening implosion. Silence returned, broken only by the distant rumble of aftershocks. David stood amidst the ruins, battered but alive. Or so he thought. Unbeknownst to David, the portal's closure hadn't erased the damage already done. Back on Earth, strange phenomena began occurring worldwide. Unexplained disappearances, bizarre weather patterns, and sightings of otherworldly entities lurking in the shadows. Governments scrambled to contain panic, but whispers of invasion spread like wildfire. Meanwhile, David drifted aimlessly in space, rescued by a passing cargo vessel days later. Physically recovered, he struggled to process what he'd witnessed. Nightmares plagued his sleep, and guilt gnawed at his conscience. Had sealing the portal truly ended the threat, or merely delayed it? Haunted by unanswered questions, David dedicated himself to uncovering the truth. He pored over classified documents, consulted experts, and pieced together fragments of information pointing to a chilling conclusion. Cryos wasn't just a planet, it was a staging ground. And whatever had crossed through the portal wasn't finished with humanity yet. David's investigation led him to an underground network of scientists and conspiracy theorists convinced that Earth faced imminent danger. Among them was Dr. Elena Vasquez, a brilliant astrophysicist dismissed from NASA due to her controversial theories about interdimensional travel. Together, they uncovered evidence suggesting multiple portals had been opened globally, each linked to different parts of Cryos. Their findings painted a grim picture. The creatures weren't merely invaders. They were scouts, probing weaknesses in humanity's defenses. Worse still, The entity David encountered claimed to serve a greater power, one capable of tearing apart entire civilizations. Armed with this knowledge, David and Elena devised a daring plan: locate and destroy the remaining portals before they could be fully activated. But doing so required infiltrating highly secured facilities guarded by military personnel unaware of the true nature of their discoveries. The duo's first target was a remote observatory hidden deep within the Siberian wilderness. Disguised as maintenance workers, they gained access to the facility undetected. Inside, they found exactly what they feared: a secondary portal humming with latent energy. Surrounding it were containment chambers housing captured creatures from cryos, their eyes glowing hungrily as they sensed intruders. Elena worked quickly, setting charges to destabilize the portal while David kept watch. Tension mounted as alarms blared unexpectedly, alerting guards to their presence. Outnumbered and outgunned, David resorted to guerrilla tactics, using the environment to his advantage. Despite narrowly avoiding capture, they succeeded in destroying the portal. However, the victory came at a cost. Security footage revealed their faces, ensuring neither could return to normal lives. More importantly, the act drew unwanted attention from both authorities and unseen forces monitoring their activities. Pursued relentlessly, David and Elena fled across continents, evading capture while continuing their mission. Along the way, they encountered others who shared their cause, forming a ragtag resistance determined to protect Earth from annihilation. United by purpose, they launched simultaneous strikes against key locations harboring portals, knowing failure meant extinction. Each operation tested their resolve, pushing them to their limits physically and emotionally. Betrayals, sacrifices, and narrow escapes became commonplace, yet their determination never wavered. Slowly but surely, they dismantled the network connecting Earth to cryos, weakening the invaders' foothold. But as successes mounted, so did signs of retaliation. Reports surfaced of coordinated attacks targeting major cities, orchestrated by beings wielding technology far beyond human comprehension. Humanity stood on the brink of war, and David knew the final battle was inevitable. The climactic confrontation unfolded in New York City, where the last known portal loomed above Times Square. Surrounded by chaos, burning buildings, panicked civilians, and swarms of monstrous foes, David led the charge alongside his allies. Armed with experimental weapons designed to counter cryogen biology, they fought valiantly, turning the tide inch by bloody inch. At the center of it all stood the Horned Leader, overseeing the assault with detached cruelty. Engaging it in single combat, David unleashed everything he had, channeling months of rage and grief into each strike. Blow after blow exchanged until finally, seizing an opening, David drove his blade straight through the creature's core. Its demise triggered a chain reaction, causing the portal to collapse catastrophically. Explosions rocked the skyline as residual energy dissipated harmlessly into the atmosphere. Exhausted but victorious, David collapsed to his knees, watching dawn break over a scarred but surviving city. Those scars remained, both physical and emotional. The world endured thanks to the bravery of those willing to stand against impossible odds. And though peace felt fragile, David vowed never to rest, knowing vigilance was the price of freedom. Though the battle in New York had ended, David knew the victory was only temporary. The portal's collapse hadn't erased the scars left behind, both on Earth and within him. Reports of cryogen activity continued to trickle in from remote corners of the globe. Villages vanished without a trace. Entire forests turned to ash overnight, and strange symbols appeared carved into mountainsides, glowing faintly under moonlight. These were signs that something or someone was still watching, waiting for an opportunity to strike again. Haunted by what he'd seen on cryos and the sacrifices made during their campaign, David struggled to find peace. Night after night, he relived the horrors: the creature's guttural growls, the oppressive heat of the obelisk, the cold malice in the leader's glowing eyes. He tried to bury himself in work, analyzing data and coordinating with Elena and other members of the resistance. But sleep brought no respite. His dreams were filled with visions of the horned figure standing over a burning earth, its voice echoing, "This is only the beginning." Elena noticed his decline. One evening, as they pored over maps marking suspected portal sites, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "David," she said softly, "we've done everything we could. You can't carry this weight alone." He shook his head, staring at the map without really seeing it. "It's not enough," he muttered. "Every time we destroy one of their footholds, they adapt. They're smarter than we thought. And if we don't stay ahead—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Elena sighed, her expression grim. "Then we prepare for what comes next. Whatever they have planned, we'll be ready." Her words did little to ease David's unease, but they reignited a spark of resolve. If humanity was going to survive, he couldn't afford to falter now. As weeks passed, David and Elena worked tirelessly to fortify Earth's defenses against further incursions. They partnered with rogue scientists, hackers, and even former military personnel who believed in their cause. Together, they developed advanced countermeasures, EMP devices capable of disrupting cryogen technology, experimental armor resistant to their acidic blood, and drones equipped with sensors tuned to detect interdimensional anomalies. But despite their efforts, the enemy remained elusive. The creatures seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving behind only destruction and unanswered questions. It wasn't until a breakthrough came from an unexpected source that the pieces began falling into place. A young hacker named Mia, part of the Resistance, uncovered encrypted files buried deep within a government database. The documents revealed the existence of Project Aegis, a classified initiative aimed at studying interdimensional travel. According to the files, researchers had successfully opened multiple portals across the globe, believing they could harness the energy for limitless power. Instead, they unleashed chaos and then covered it up, labeling the incidents as natural disasters or terrorist attacks. The most alarming revelation, however, was the mention of a central hub, a massive underground facility located beneath Mount Erebus in Antarctica. This was where the initial experiments had taken place, and where the true mastermind behind the invasion likely resided. When David heard the news, his stomach churned. "If we're right about this," he said, pacing the room, "then destroying the smaller portals won't matter. We need to shut down the source."
Elena nodded grimly.
"And we'll need more than just us. This is going to take everything we've got." Mount Erebus loomed like a sentinel at the edge of the world, its snow-capped peak shrouded in perpetual mist. Beneath its frozen surface lay the heart of humanity's darkest secret, a labyrinthine complex teeming with guards, automated defenses, and untold horrors. Breaking in would be suicide, but David and his team had no choice. They approached under cover of darkness, their modified transport vehicle disguised as a supply truck. Inside, the resistance squad prepared for the mission ahead. Each member carried specialized gear tailored to their role: explosives experts, medics, engineers, and combat specialists. David, leading the charge, reviewed the plan one last time. "Remember," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air, "our priority is the core chamber. Disable whatever's powering the portals, and we might stand a chance. But if things go south, we don't hesitate. We blow the whole place." The team nodded, faces pale but determined. As they neared the entrance, the vehicle slowed to a crawl. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their breath visible in the frigid air. Using silenced weapons and stealth tactics, the squad neutralized them quickly and slipped inside unnoticed. The interior was a maze of steel corridors and humming machinery, lit by harsh fluorescent lights. Every step echoed ominously, heightening the sense of dread. Then, as they rounded a corner, a patrol spotted them. Gunfire erupted, forcing the team to scatter. Chaos descended as alarms blared and reinforcements poured in. David barked orders, directing his team toward the core while holding off waves of attackers. Bullets ricocheted off walls, and smoke filled the air. Despite the odds, they pressed forward, driven by desperation and sheer willpower. Finally, they reached the core chamber, a cavernous room dominated by a towering machine pulsating with dark energy. At its center floated a shard of the same obsidian-like material David had touched aboard the space station. It radiated power, feeding countless conduits snaking outward like veins. "This is it," Elena whispered, her voice trembling with awe and fear. "Turn this off, and we cut them off for good." David hesitated, staring at the shard. Something felt wrong. The hum emanating from it was almost hypnotic, pulling at his consciousness like a siren's call. He shook his head, trying to focus. "We don't have much time," he said, turning to Elena. "Set the charges." She nodded, moving to plant explosives strategically around the chamber. Meanwhile, David kept watch, fending off bursts of static interference that disrupted their comms. The rest of the team fought valiantly to hold the line, but casualties mounted. Just as Elena finished arming the charges, the ground quaked violently. From the shadows emerged the horned figure, the same entity David had faced on Cryos. Its presence radiated pure malice, freezing everyone in place. "You cannot undo what has been set in motion," it declared, raising its massive sword. Energy crackled along its blade, casting eerie reflections on the walls. David stepped forward, gripping his weapon tightly. "Maybe not," he replied, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "But I can sure as hell try." The entity lunged, faster than anything David had ever encountered. Their clash sent shockwaves rippling through the chamber, knocking equipment loose and sparking fires. Sparks flew as metal met energy, each strike reverberating like thunder. Elena shouted from across the room, "David, we need to go. Now." He glanced at her, torn between finishing the fight and escaping. But the timer on the explosives ticked down mercilessly. With a final desperate swing, David drove the entity back long enough to retreat. "Everyone out!" he yelled, sprinting toward the exit. Behind them, the core began destabilizing, releasing torrents of raw energy. The team barely made it outside before the facility imploded, sending a shockwave rippling across the icy landscape. Snow and debris rained down as they huddled together, shielding themselves from the blast. When the dust settled, silence reigned, broken only by the howling wind. David stared at the smoking crater, his chest heaving. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a moment of hope. The portals were gone, or so he prayed. But as he looked at the faces of his comrades, weary yet alive, he knew the fight wasn't truly over. Back home, the world began to heal. Governments scrambled to address the fallout, both literal and political. Stories of the resistance spread, inspiring others to rebuild and prepare for whatever challenges lay ahead. For David, life returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the scars remained. He visited Elena often, grateful for her unwavering support. Together, they monitored global activity, ensuring no new threats emerged. Yet late at night, when the world was quiet, David sometimes wondered if they truly won, or simply delayed the inevitable. The stars above seemed colder now, distant and indifferent. Somewhere out there, beyond the void, Cryos waited. And so did he. If you enjoyed this epic journey through the unknown, don't miss out on more thrilling adventures. Subscribe now to stay updated on our latest stories that push the boundaries of science fiction and suspense.